If you are considering an investment into the UAE real estate market, or you have already made a purchase and you want to know what the next steps are, I have rolled everything into a complete guide broken down into 9 chapters. Throughout this video, I will cover off everything from how to evaluate an off-plan project, payment plan breakdowns, off-plan mortgages, foreign exchange, moving money here in the most cost-effective way, reselling an off-plan property, when you can sell, why you would sell, when's the best time to sell, renting a property out, whether that's short-term rental or long-term rental, what are the fees involved, property management, when you would need it, why you would need it, and what it entails. And then finally, the golden visa and the investor visa, what they are and how you get them. Let's get right into it. Chapter 1. And possibly the most important part of your investment journey is how to evaluate an off-plan project, because this is going to dictate your rental yield, this is going to dictate your capital appreciation. And how do we start? Well, first of all, you need to choose your developer. So of course, the very first thing that I look at is which developer you are investing with. In the UAE, you have government-backed developers and you have private developers. So when we're looking at a developer, that is the first thing we will check out, is whether they're privately funded or whether they're backed by the government. And then number 2, we will check how they are financed. So of course, if they're government backed, you know they're very well financed. However, if they are privately backed, we know we need to dig into a bit more detail of the ownership and where the money is coming from, because this will have a very important part of whether the developer are waiting for your funds to move into the escrow to then start the project build, or whether they already have the funds to just build the project without the sales at all. We need to look at the leadership of the developer. What's their track record? What have they done in the past? Where have they come from? Just to know that whoever is in control of this developer knows what they are doing and they have a proven track record within the UAE. This is very, very important. That also ties into the previous history of the developer, because to be honest with you, quite often there will be a new developer in the market who actually provides a good investment. However, if they don't have previous experience in their leadership team, that to me does not add up. So we need to make sure that the leadership and the previous history of that leadership is in line. And then finally, because if you have a very good leadership, generally they will use experienced contractors. They will have used them in the past, and your contractor is very important to the performance of your project. So again, leadership, financing, and developer are absolutely key to any off-plan investment. Moving on from developer, we have point number 2, which is location. Of course, why is location so important? Because we need to know who is going to rent this property from you, who is going to buy this property from you. So my investment strategy, I like to follow white collar demand, corporate professionals, whether that's in finance, legal, oil and gas. We need to know who's going to rent it, who's going to live here. Of course, you can also follow waterfront or beachfront property, which might have a retiree that would live there, or a businessman or woman who doesn't need to go to a place of work and they want to live by the water. So of course, there's multiple different strategies, but again, we need to evaluate the location based on these fundamentals. And finally, we of course need to look at existing infrastructure. What are you surrounded by? Which schools are you surrounded by? Which shopping malls, healthcare, all of these kind of facilities, transport networks. These are very, very important. But of course, we can look at future planned infrastructure that will be coming in the next 2, 3, 4 years, which will of course also appreciate your asset. So that is key points to any off-plan investment, is looking at the location and what is surrounding it. Moving on to point number 3, we need to look at the supply metrics of this location, this project community, because the biggest driver of real estate performance is supply and demand. So of course, we need to understand the supply. So looking at a location, we need to know, right, what is going into this location? How much demand does this location have? But then when we break down your project specifically, we need to look at individual unit types. So if you're looking at a 4-bedroom villa, how many 4-bedroom villas are there? If you're looking at a 2-bedroom apartment, how many 2-bedroom apartments are there? Because this is a key fundamental to real estate performance, especially in a market like Dubai, where we have potential oversupply risk in certain segments of the market. So of course, this is the number 1 thing that I will be doing, is checking out the supply metrics of your individual project and your individual unit type. And then we can even break it down further to go, well, out of these 2 bedrooms, which are the best 2 bedrooms within the project to invest in for performance? Because not all 2 bedrooms will perform in parallel. Some will perform better than others based on their position, size, views, everything you need to consider. So of course, when we break down a project, this is a key one to look at. Okay, point number 4, which is very, very important now more than ever, is the community and lifestyle offerings of a project. Because over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen projects get better and better at the quality of life that they offer. So it can no longer just be a basic podium, pool, gym, and tower project. You need to offer more of a lifestyle. So the only projects that I will sell to my clients will be ones that have a community offering, whether that's a resort style project where you've got low-rise apartments with multiple swimming pools, lap pools, running tracks, cycle tracks, but then even into the further details of the actual health and well-being facilities. So whether that's materials used, air quality, water supply, everything that goes into the longevity and quality of life of a human, these are the factors that will start to make real estate perform better in future years. So again, these are the kind of things that we need to look out for in terms of detail in projects these days. Okay, now number 5, which is probably the key fundamental to any off-plan investment, is comparing the price and size of your surrounding projects, whether that's projects on the ready market that are already completed or recent off-plan projects that have sold that you'll be competing with come handover. Okay, so when we're comparing versus the ready market, we need to make sure that it is a comparable project. So it has a very similar standard of finish, a very similar standard of offering. And then of course, we need to make sure that we're entering well below this price on the ready market so we can ensure there is a gap for appreciation. However, when we're looking versus recent off-plan projects, we need to make sure that our project is actually better than that project. It offers more of a lifestyle, all the key things that I mentioned in the points before. So when we both come to handover, our project is more desirable than their project, and of course at a comparable price. But the key being, we need to make sure that we have growth within the project versus the comparable surrounding projects, or we add more of a value and more of a lifestyle to what's coming to market. Okay, now point 6 is specific unit selection, something that I touched on back in point 3, because not every unit in every great project is a good investment. We have to make sure that we are choosing the right unit to make sure we perform the best, because ultimately, if you are investing in a project, you want to make sure you have the best opportunity at the best performance. Okay, so this can cover everything from the size of the apartment, because not every single 2-bedroom will be exactly the same size, because within the project, there will be different unit types for 2 bedrooms. So of course, we need to take that into consideration. We of course then need to look at the floor level, which floor level makes the most sense, because of course, the higher levels will be the most expensive. However, that doesn't always make them the best option. And then of course, we look at positioning within the building. So which view do we have? Which way do we want to face? Not every project is sold on a dream view. So again, we need to decide whether the most desired view is the most cost effective or the most effective for performance, because it's not always the case. Sometimes if you're looking for short-term rental, the entry price is more important than the view, because that will dictate your rental yield on short-term rental. So these are the factors that we need to take into consideration when choosing your unit, depending on your desired outcome. Okay, point 7 is quite an important one, which is your construction timeline. How long are they going to take to build your project? This will impact things like your payment plan, because some payment plans will be construction linked and some will be time linked, which I'll go on to talk about in the next point. However, it also impacts things like how long is it going to give surrounding infrastructure to be built, of course, impacting appreciation on your project, schools that are coming or road networks that will be built. These are all factors into the capital appreciation of your project. So again, we will pay attention to your construction timeline. Point number 8, which is payment plans. Now, I am going to do a very detailed video on payment plans. However, for the purpose of this video, I will just explain to you in basic terms what a payment plan is. So in the UAE, we have various different sort of payment plan methods. So the best way I can explain it is you have a portion of capital required during construction, and you have a portion of capital required on handover, which is when you get the keys for your property. So completion of the project. So the basic one to explain would be a 50-50. 50% during construction and 50% on handover. So the 50% during construction will be paid in installments. So for example, it might be 10% down payment when you make your deposit. The remaining 40% will be spread across a different time period. So you might have a payment plan that is construction linked. So this means when the developer reaches certain milestones of construction, you need to make another payment, which might be 5 or 10% towards the property. But you might also have a time linked payment plan, which means it will be set dates when you make your payments, no matter where the construction progression is. So even if a construction is delayed, you still need to make your payment. So some people prefer construction linked, some people prefer time linked. Now, a payment plan can make a big impact on your investment. However, it is definitely not the deciding factor as to why we will choose an investment. However, for example, if your payment plan is 50-50, if you decide to sell this property before handover, it does mean that you'll have good leverage on the return on equity, because if it appreciates 10%, you will actually make a 20% return on the equity you have put in, because 10% appreciation means 20% return on the 50% you've put into the property. However, I can explain those factors in more detail when we discuss a certain project on the phone. And if you would like to watch my next video, it will go into that in much more detail. However, all of these key 8 fundamentals are how we break down an off-plan project, and they are so important to the performance of your investment. If you are interested in understanding which projects across the UAE that I have evaluated with this criteria, please feel free to message me in the details in the description below. But if not, we're moving on to chapter 2. Chapter 2, which is a detailed payment plan breakdown. Now, your payment plan will not be a fundamental that is a deciding factor to your investment. However, it is of course a key factor to when your capital is required and why your capital is required and how much. So of course, when I say why, this means if you have a construction linked payment plan or a time linked payment plan. Now, what is the difference between the two? Construction linked is when your installment is due at a construction milestone. For example, if you are buying a villa, generally when the groundworks for your villa are complete, you will be due to make an installment payment. When the first floor is complete, another installment. And when the roof is on, another installment. So that explains that your payments are made due to construction milestones. Now, time linked is simply dates set within your sales purchase agreement. So of course, every 6 months, every 3 months, something like this, depending on the timeline of construction will determine how spaced out your payments are. Some people prefer construction linked because if your project is delayed, you do not need to make payment. But however, a time linked, even if your project is delayed, you still need to make the payment when it is due. So that explains the 2 different types of payment plan. Now, of course, with payment plans, we have various different ratios with regards to how much capital during construction and how much on handover. So your common payment plan would be, let's say, a 50-50, which means 50% during construction and 50% on handover, which is completion, when you get the keys to your property. Now, sometimes you might have a post-handover payment plan, which means the 50% that is due on handover is actually an interest-free, spread out payment plan after you get the keys. So you will pay in installments after the handover date towards the developer. So it's not a mortgage, but it works very much like one. So it means your rental payments can actually pay towards the property itself. Again, post-handover payment plans are quite rare at the moment. However, they do happen and they are important to know about. Now, it's very important sometimes when you're looking at a payment plan to understand how front heavy the payment plan is. So front heavy means how much capital is required during construction. For example, Emaar, one of the biggest developers in Dubai, the most famous developers in Dubai, they are known for having their 80-20 payment plan, which means 80% during construction, which of course means your leverage is not very good to sell during construction. However, you do have the opportunity to mortgage during construction. So from 50% paid and 50% constructed, you can mortgage your off-plan property, which I'll go into talk about mortgages in a bit more detail in the next chapter. However, the weight of your payment plan can be very, very impactful to your return on equity if you look at selling during construction. However, that is not usually my sales tactic. My sales tactic is always to look at your end user demand, your potential rental return, make sure you buy a project that will sell out. So then of course, if the opportunity presents itself to sell during construction, we have that opportunity, but it's definitely not a key factor when making your investment. Now, a couple of key points that I want to make with regards to payment plans is late payment fees. What happens if you miss a payment? Now, this differentiates from every developer. Not all developers are the same. The most common that I have seen is if you are past the due date of your payment, you will incur a 1% per month fee of the installment that is due. So for example, if your installment was 10,000 dirhams, you will incur a 100 dirham fee for that month. So again, that will incur every single month of that payment being due. Now, with regards to termination of your contract, most sales purchase agreements will state after 60 days, the developer is allowed to contact RERA to terminate your contract. However, this is generally not the practice. However, we will assess your SPA at any time of making a purchase just to understand what the criteria is with regards to termination. But it's very unlikely. I've not seen it done before, and I've seen many payments being very late. However, generally, your late payment fees will be 1% monthly of that installment itself, not the total property value. Now, just finally, and not so tied to payment plans, however, it's a very important point. What happens if a project is delayed? What sort of compensation do you get? Well, in the UAE, by law, a developer is allowed to delay a project by 12 months with no compensation to the investor. However, after the 12-month period, you will receive some form of compensation, which again is to the discretion of the sales purchase agreement. So these are key factors, but we will go into the details of the SPA at time of signing to ensure we know exactly what you are signing up to. Chapter 3, which is off-plan mortgages. Now, this is a very key point to my personal investment strategy because I will be utilizing mortgages to build out my portfolio. However, not everyone is aware that you are able to mortgage off-plan, how that works, when you would mortgage, why you would mortgage, what are the fees involved. So I'll break it down for you in this video. Now, firstly, most of the time you will only utilize a mortgage to pay your handover payment. However, this will be impacted by the percentage of capital required during construction. So for example, you are able to mortgage from 50% paid and 50% constructed of your off-plan project. So for example, if you're buying with EMAR on an 80-20 payment plan, you can actually mortgage from 50% paid and the bank will pay the installments of your payment plan. However, of course, if you invest in a 40-60 payment plan, you can mortgage the full 60% handover payment, which is obviously very lucrative. Now, who can get a mortgage? Well, everyone can get a mortgage, whether you are a UAE resident or not. However, majority of the time, as long as you have made a purchase over 2 million dirhams, you will of course get your golden visa. And then of course, you'll be classed as a UAE resident. Now, a UAE resident's mortgage is usually around 4.25 to 4.5% interest. And a non-resident's mortgage is generally around 6% interest. And it is pretty much to the discretion of your personal income status whether you will be eligible for a mortgage. However, of course, the mortgage advisor can get you pre-approval and give you a good understanding of whether you will be eligible at the time it is required, which of course is when we come closer to the handover or your 50% milestone on your construction payment plan. Now, there are some key factors when looking at off-plan mortgages to pay attention to. If you are looking at a mid-payment plan mortgage, so for example, a mortgage that requires the bank to pay certain installments, as I said with EMAR, the banks will only mortgage certain developers. So generally they need to be a tier 1 developer, whether that's government tied or very financially backed. Certain banks will only mortgage certain developers. However, of course, if you are looking for a mortgage on a payment plan which would be less than a 50-50, for example, so 50-50 or less, then the bank will mortgage the whole handover payment regardless of the developer, because you will have what's called your BCC, Building Completion Certificate. The bank will pay your handover payment and then you can get the keys for your finished property. So that just explains certain banks will only mortgage certain developers if it is mid-construction. Now let me tell you in a bit more detail about my investment strategy and why I will be utilizing bank finance. So let's use the most basic example of a 50-50 payment plan. So if you utilize the bank to pay your handover payment of 50%, this mortgage will be given on the purchase price you paid when you bought the off-plan property. Once you have now got the keys, you have a tenant in the property, you can get a revaluation from the bank at the new property value. But you can also release equity down to 80% loan to value as long as you are a resident. So of course, you are not only releasing the equity of appreciation that has happened since you purchased it, but you are also releasing 30% of equity that you put into the property. So again, utilizing that equity that you are releasing, you can then go ahead and buy another property, which again, to me, is textbook real estate and how you build out a off-plan portfolio, or to be honest, a property portfolio utilizing off-plan and utilizing bank borrowing. Chapter 4, which is foreign exchange. So this is moving your money internationally in the smartest way possible. So for example, if you were utilizing a bank to do cross-border bank transfers, generally you will be charged at the worst exchange rate possible. So I'm here to explain to you the most cost-effective way to do it. If you use a foreign exchange company, they will be able to give you a much more attractive rate than the bank on, let's say, pounds to dirhams. They will give you maybe a rate at 4.9, for example, rather than the bank might give you 4.7. So again, it is always a sensible thing to do is utilizing a foreign exchange company, which of course I can put you in touch with some trusted partners. Now, a good foreign exchange company will also explain to you what rate staking means. Now, the best way that I can explain to you is, of course, on your payment plan, you are required to make payments at different dates on your timeline. So for example, if today's exchange rate is very, very good, it might be worth booking in advance at this rate payments that you need to make in the future. Because of course, if the rate is now much lower when your installment is due, you'll wish you exchanged more at the date where the rate was the best. So of course, an experienced exchange advisor will basically be able to average out your staking throughout your time of construction to ensure that your average rate is at the best rate possible. Of course, they will not stake the full value at today's rate because the rate might go up, but they will be able to explain to you in the best way possible how to average out your payments across construction. So I think that's the best way that I can explain to you rate staking. Chapter 5, reselling your off-plan property. When can you sell? Why would you sell? How can you sell? Or when is the best time to sell? So yes, of course, you are able to sell your property during construction. However, this is to the discretion of the developer when you are allowed to do it. So it will be very clearly laid out at the time of purchase at what point you are able to sell it. So the developer does have to provide a permit for sale, which is called your NOC, non-objection certificate. And this can differ at percentage milestones of construction. The most common is generally 30%. However, it could be 20%, it could be 50%. It all depends on the specific developer. Now, just because you can sell does not mean it is a good time to sell. You are often able to sell the property before you reach the point of NOC, but it just means that the purchaser has to pay the total percentage required. So if you've only paid 20%, but the resale value is 50%, the person who's coming to buy it from you has to pay the 50% total, which is obviously very unlikely because there's absolutely no benefit to them to do that. So again, it does depend on the developer, and of course, it is definitely not the right time to sell. Certain projects that have sold out and are in huge demand will give you the good opportunity to sell during construction for a profit, which of course means you have good leverage within your resale, which means you can get a good return on the equity that you have put in. But again, this all depends on the specific project, and they are becoming few and far between in the market. My honest advice is when you are purchasing a project, do not purchase it with the flip mentality, which means selling it before handover. Make sure you purchase with the rental yield in mind and the end user in mind. And then if the opportunity arises for a good exit during construction, then take that opportunity if you wish. However, of course, I will always sell you a project based on the end user in mind. So if you do wish to sell the property during construction, generally you will not find a buyer by advertising online. However, you are able to advertise on the property portals, but of course you are only able to use the brochure images, just as you saw when you purchased the property yourself. So of course, if you want to advertise your property online, you will require your NOC certificate, which actually incurs a fee from the developer in order to get this. It's only a small fee and it differs from developer to developer. Now, of course, if you want a broker to sell the property for you, there will be a 2% commission fee that the seller will pay to the broker in order to facilitate the sale. Of course, there will also be a 2% fee from the buyer's side. So the buyer who comes to buy it from you will also pay a 2% fee, and that buyer will also be required to pay your 4% Dubai Land Department fee for any sales purchase as normal. Of course, if you are looking in Abu Dhabi, that will be a 2% ADM fee rather than your 4% in Dubai. Now, the actual sales process, as the seller of the property, you will sign what's called a Form A, which is a form between you and your broker who is listing the property. And this will have agreement in place of the value of the property that you are asking for. When it comes to the point of sale, the broker will also sign a Form B, which is between the broker and the buyer, which of course has different details included also. And then finally, the official contract will be your Form F, which is between the buyer and the seller. Now, this can include various different clauses, which include, let's say, payment timelines, transfer timelines, which can differ due to the agreement made between the buyer and the seller. Now, if it is a ready property, this could include things like which furniture is included in the sale, whether there's a washing machine or different agreements put in place by the buyer and the seller, which will incorporate the Form F. And this will be the legally binding contract that is made between the two parties and must be adhered to legally. If it is an off-plan resale, you will be transferring your OQ'd. So your OQ'd is your title deed during construction. Of course, this will be transferred at the DLD trustee's office when the NOC is presented, and the new OQ'd will be issued in the purchaser's name. Now, if it is a post-handover sale, so a secondary market sale, of course, it will be the same process. However, it will be a transfer of title deed rather than OQ'd, because you will have the official title deed for the property. However, they are both a formal DLD supervised process, not just a handshake. They are issued by the Dubai Land Department. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 5. Now, if you've made it this far and you have any specific questions that you would like to ask or any details that you think I have missed out, feel free to ask in the comment section below or contact me in the details within the description of the video. And always feel free to like and subscribe. Chapter 6, which is renting your property. So of course you have two different types. You have long-term rental and you have short-term rental. But starting with long-term rental, so initially the first contract you will sign is your Form A, which again is between the landlord and the broker who is advertising the property, which is just the agreement of the asking price of the property and the requirements of the advertisement. Now, when it comes to the actual contracts, it is slightly different. So you just make a tenancy contract, which of course is between the tenant and the landlord. Now, in order to make the tenancy contract official, once all is signed and agreed, you submit it with the DLD and you get your Ajari, which is your legally binding tenancy contract, which is actioned on the day of move-in. So once your Ajari is actioned, you get the keys and you move into the property, which is the date that was agreed on your tenancy contract. So that is the legalities with regards to tenancy contracts. Now let's just look at some of the fees that go with renting a property. So the agency fee with regards to renting a property is 5%, which is paid by the tenant which is moving in. You then also have the Ajari registration. So this is also paid by the tenant. However, of course, you have the service charge of the property. Now, the service charge is always paid by the landlord. And of course, this differs from property to property, but the landlord will be very aware what his service charge is because he pays it from the day that he owns the property. Now, things like DEWA, which is your utility and connection, is generally paid by the tenant. However, things like AC can differ from building to building because they may be paid for by or they may be covered depending on which building that you're in. So for example, I lived in serviced accommodation last year where the AC was covered just in the building service charge. Now, things like property management. So a landlord may choose to pay for a property management company to manage the property for them if they are overseas, for example, or if they have a large portfolio. The cost of property management would be paid for by the landlord. It would not be paid for by the tenant. Now, moving on to short-term rental. Now, you do require a permit from the government in order to short-term rent your property, which is through the Trachisi system. However, my honest advice is when short-term renting your apartment, I would always utilize a short-term rental management company who will help you with this process. If you would like me to recommend one, please feel free to message me in the details in the caption. However, when considering putting your property up for short-term rental, you need to think about where your demand is coming from. Is it coming from tourism or is it coming from corporate demand? So two perfect examples right now. In Dubai, I would recommend a corporate demand location like Expo City, where you have the exhibition center with 500,000 visitors a month who would need to short-term rent your property for convenience and a short-term stay while visiting the Expo Center. Or, for example, you might have Yas Point, which is on Yas Island, which is a very good option for entertainment tourism from Yas Island and, of course, the new Disney, which is to come. However, of course, if you use a short-term rental management company, they will take between 15 and 20% of the monthly revenue from your property as their fee. Now, of course, within that, they will manage absolutely everything regards to that property. So, for example, if there is damage, they will recoup the damage cost from the tenant who was in the property. However, of course, all the standard fees for the property and actually all the utility bills are paid for by the landlord. So your DEWA bill, your electric bill, your AC bill, your furnishings, everything, your service charge is all paid for by the landlord when short-term renting. However, of course, you would hope and expect your short-term rental revenue to be much higher than if you were renting long-term. But that's all factors that you need to pay attention to. And again, if you'd like advice on whether I advise you to short-term rent your property, feel free to message me and I'm happy to talk you through it. Chapter 7, property management. What is it? Why would you use it? And is it a requirement? Well, it is not a requirement. Property management is just an additional service to a landlord who pretty much wants a hassle-free management of their property. So this might be useful if you are overseas and you are not in the UAE, or if you have multiple properties within your portfolio and you don't want to have to be hands-on with the management of the property. So of course, if you get a phone call at 11 o'clock at night because there is an issue with the property, you could obviously give this responsibility to a property management company to handle. They would also handle everything from move-in with tenant, a JARI registration, everything you can imagine with regards to handling the property. A property management company would do it for you. Generally, they charge between 5 and 8% of the annual rent. So for example, 100,000 per year, they may charge between 5 and 8,000 for the year of management. Chapter 8, the Golden Visa. Now, what is the Golden Visa and how do you get it? So the Golden Visa, of course, is a 10-year residency to the UAE, and you get it as a property owner of a property over the value of 2 million dirhams. Now, this can differ. If you purchase a property over 2 million off plan in Dubai, you are able to get the Golden Visa after your initial down payment. So once you receive your OQ'd, which is your title deed, you are then able to apply for your Golden Visa. Now, just because you become eligible for the Golden Visa does not mean it is free of charge. There is still a cost to get the visa. And of course, you are able to sponsor your direct family. So let's say your spouse and your children. And they also, in order to sponsor them, incurs another charge. So generally, the cost for the visa is around 15,000 dirhams or £3,000 per person. So again, this is individual per person, and it just makes you eligible through a purchase over 2 million dirhams. And chapter 9, finally, the investor visa. What is it? It is a 2-year visa that is eligible with a property purchase over 750,000 dirhams. So again, very much like the Golden Visa. However, the requirement is only 750,000 dirhams or 150,000 pounds. So very, very similar to the Golden Visa. The application process is exactly the same, just with a lower requirement, and it is only for 2 years. Okay, so there is the high-level basics of off-plan investing. Now, if you wanted to book a consultation with me, my details are in the description below, or you can visit my website, offplanjosh.com, or of course, my Instagram, which is @offplanjosh. But there we go. My name is Josh Packer. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope that was helpful with regards to what to avoid in the UAE real estate market, and of course, how we pinpoint a good investment. But feel free to reach out to me. I'd be very happy to help you.